Chapter 3. A ship is called She because her rigging costs more than her hull. Father had devised and carried out the scheme for nourishing a baby at sea, but another and more difficult problem for any man is clothing womenfolk. When I was 2 years old, I could walk and say, "Goddamned wind." That was my first sentence, which I picked up from the mate. I had outgrown my baby dresses, so something had to be done about it. On deep-water vessels, the crew, as well as the mates and captain, usually wear coarse dungarees and heavy woolens in cold weather, white cotton undershirts and short cotton trousers in the tropics. Shoes are worn only in port, as it is too dangerous, as well as too expensive, for sailor men to walk around the slippery decks in leather soles. When I began to walk by holding on to the rail of the poop deck, we were off Easter Island, getting a load of guano, which is bird manure used for fertilizing purposes. It would be months before we hailed the mainland. So again, Father was ingenious in solving a difficulty. I had to have something to wear. Father turned the fossil into a sewing room. His seamstresses were Lars Eriksson, a Dane, Scotty, an old Scottish sailor who had only one snag tooth in his mouth, and that brown from tobacco stain, and the trusty Stitches. These men were commissioned to make my wardrobe. They cut a small pair of pants from Stitch's well-worn dungarees and made little suspenders on them. The buttonholes were works of art embroidered with infinite pains by Stitches. While they were engrossed in their sewing, a Hungarian sailor, who was a bit of a bully, by name Guni Bolger, leaned out of his bunk and remarked, "You ladies of the sewing circle will now adjourn, and tea will be served in the captain's parlour," with which he waved an effeminate coy hand in the shellbacks' faces. It was never definitely settled which of them landed on him first. Bolger claimed that Stitches had scratched him with his needle, and none would bear witness that Scotty and Eriksson hadn't used a steel marlin spike on him. At any rate, he resembled a piece of raw hamburger steak when they brought his limp body aft to my father to be revived. If there is one thing prevalent on shipboard, it is he-men, and any suggestion that impugns their virility has to be settled with belaying pins to the finish. Whatever really happened, the event is recorded in the logbook as follows. This day at sea, the 27th of September, able-bodied seaman Gustav Bolger fell, in the course of duty, off the fossil head onto the main deck and was badly injured. Treated by captain. Given dose of salts and wounds painted with friar's balsam. Captain found it advisable to fine seaman $5 for carelessness. After that slight interruption to their sewing, the three men resumed and turned out a complete wardrobe for me. Scotty had an old pair of rubber sea boots that were worn out at the bottoms, so he cut off the tops and turned out a pair of tiny rubber sea boots for me. With the remaining scraps, he fashioned a southwester oilskin hat for me. He was at a loss for something to line it with, as the only available material on the ship was cast-off clothing. A sailor never does anything by halves, and unless that sou'wester was lined, it was not complete in his estimation. As he was taking a mental inventory of the material he could lay his hands on in the fossil, Pimples, the cabin boy, came in. It was his first trip at sea. He had come to get experiences so that he would be a famous writer of sea stories like Jack London. He was still so green in the ways of the sea that he wore shoes and socks. Pimples had won his cognomen by his complexion, which was caused half by adolescence and half by the food which fell to his lot after the crew and captain had eaten the best of it. It was unfortunate for Pimples that he intruded into the fossil at that moment, for Scotty saw his shoes and socks. "Come here, Barnacles," he cooed to the cabin boy. "Come closer, so I can see how big your muscles are getting now that you're at sea." Pimples came over to him eagerly, happy to be recognized as an equal by a regular sailor. When he was close enough, Scotty tripped him and sat on his stomach. While Pimples squirmed, Scotty took off his shoes and socks, and holding a brown woolen sock up for the others to see, he shouted, Here's the lining for the sou'wester," and then he booted the luckless cabin boy out of the fossil. When the little clothes were finished and the sock-lined oilskin cap proudly displayed, the sailors called in the Jap cook, Yamashita, to approve of their handiwork. The cook looked at them and then snorted with oriental disapproval. Where is the nightgown for Missy? No damn sense sailor got." He went back to his galley and presently emerged with 2 bottles and 3 flour sacks. The bottles contained cake frosting coloring, red and green. He then took some string and dipped it in the red and made red string, and then dipped more string in the green. These colored strings he used to embroider intricate cross-stitch designs on the neck and arms of the flour sack nightgown and dress. In spite of his many washings of the sacks to remove the printing on them, a dim memory of the words "pure as drifted snow" remained on them forever. I wore overalls all my life on board the ship. Father kept me dressed as a boy in fairness to the crew and for my protection. He did everything in his power to keep them and me from being conscious of my sex. When I was big enough to wear them, Father brought me regular men's-size overalls. They buttoned in front, and I was very proud that even in my clothing I resembled the sailors. I had one unfortunate experience when I tried to imitate the men in using the front part of my overalls. I was so humiliated at my failure, and Father's way of punishing me was to have Stitches sew up the fronts of both pairs of my overalls, my weekday and Sunday pair, with double stitching of heavy twine. The first time I wore a dress after I left the ship, I didn't know how to walk in it. The skirt got tangled up in my legs and kept me from taking long sea strides. I had to wear underclothes with a dress, and they seemed to stifle my body that was used to salt-soak overalls next to bare skin. It was a tragic day for me when Father informed me that with a dress I had to wear shoes and stockings. The shoes hurt my feet and the cotton stockings itched, but more on the impediments of civilization later. To go back to my babyhood, when a young lady is big enough to walk, able to say "goddamned wind," and to occupy the attention of 3 tailors, it is obviously time to begin thinking of her education. Father and Stitches consulted gravely. "The first thing she's got to learn, Captain," argued Stitches, "is to keep from falling overboard." "All right," agreed Father. "Every time you catch her near the rail, paddle her bottom." Stitches nodded in partial approval. "That's all right too, Cap'n, but kids is naturally ornery and their stern gets calloused awful fast." Father saw the point. "We'll tie her up," he said. So they put me at the end of a 15-foot rope tied to the wheel box on the poop deck. That was fine for a few days, until in a sudden blow I got the rope round the steersman's feet, with the result that my head and his stern nearly broke the deck and the ship got off her course. Stitches and Father again went into conference. "In 1 week she slipped her hawser twice and tripped up the steersman. We got to try something else, Captain," urged Stitches. Father thought it over. "Sooner or later she's pretty sure to go overboard anyhow, so you'd better teach her to swim." "Oh, that's a fine idea, Captain," replied Stitches. "Only I don't know how to swim myself." Which is one of the queer things about the sea. More than half of the sailors can't swim. "You fix the tank, I'll teach her," decided Father. Just aft of the mizzenmast, Stitches rigged up a canvas tank about 4 feet square and equally deep. This was collapsible, so that when it was empty it could be folded up and put in the cabin out of the way of the storms. It was a sailor's job to fill it with sea water every morning. This he did by throwing overboard a canvas bucket in which he bailed up 100 gallons of water to fill it. When it was full, he reported the fact to my father. Then my father would go to my hammock, get me and carry me down to the tank. I was a wiggling, squirming, protesting bundle of muscular little girl, as husky as a seal and full of objections to the idea of being pulled out of a comfortable warm hammock and plunged naked into a cold sea dip. The routine was always the same. Before he plunged me into the tank, he would roll me on the deck. Then he would make me turn somersaults and box with him. My share of the boxing might be described as down again and up again. As soon as I could get to my feet, he would tumble me over with his paw-like hand, and keep that up for about 10 minutes. If I cried or protested at all against the rough treatment, I got a sound slap on my bottom to knock that nonsense out of you. Then came the great moment when, warm and glowing, I was plopped into the cold sea water to strike out blindly and in vain. Holding his hand under my back, my father told me to throw out my stomach and bend my head back to balance. I couldn't understand how it would help me float, because when I put my head back, I got my mouth and ears and eyes full of salt water. Then he explained it in words to penetrate my infant comprehension. "Throw your head back and puff your stomach up until you can see your belly button." Then it became a game, and in my eagerness to see if I could puff my stomach up high enough for me to see that portion of my anatomy, I achieved the art of floating. While I was thus absorbed in watching myself perform, Father took his bracing hand from under my back and left me to my own resources. Once I learned to float, swimming came easy, and I soon outgrew the limitations of the 4-foot tank. I didn't think I had, but Father did. The next port we arrived in was Newcastle, Australia, and he chose that harbour to polish off my swimming ability. When he looked for me to begin another lesson, he found me playing with a tame goonie on the deck, perfectly contented. A goonie is a species of gull, dull grey in colouring, and a bit larger than the common seagull. Father had snagged him on a big hook baited with a piece of salt pork, pulled him aboard and clipped his wings so that he could not fly away. When we first got him, the goonie tried to bite, but by feeding him a few days he became tame, and quite a fascinating toy for me. We had named him Salt Pork. We were playing a game called Grub, which Stitches had invented for us. Grub was a unique game in that it gave me my first philosophy of doing things for myself, and increased my propelling powers immensely. The rules for Grub were simple. A line was drawn on the poop deck with chalk, behind which Salt Pork and I lined up. The goal was a piece of bread on the rail aft by the wheel. At a given signal from Stitches, he let go of Salt Pork, and off we both went to cross the deck after the grub, me a hungry kid and Salt Pork a ravenous seabird. I crawled on all fours after it, and the goonie ran with webbed feet. If I got there first, I ate the bread on the spot as fast as I could cram it down my gullet, or Salt Pork would have grabbed it right out of my hand. If Salt Pork got to it first, I couldn't get it away from him, because he'd swallow it whole without even chewing it. "Say, Stitches," called Father from the gangway, "let's give Joan a lesson in keeping her mouth shut." He undressed me and took me to the fossil head. 2 of the crew were cooling off with a nice swim under the shadow of the bowsprit. He called to them to keep an eye on me, and without warning he threw me 15 feet into the water below. I thought I had sunk to the bottom of the world and would never come up. When I finally did, I was so frightened that I started to yell and was rewarded with a mouthful of seawater. There was nothing to hang on to, so I had to swim. My father and Stitches on the jib boom above laughed at my struggle. Of course there was no danger for me, as the 2 sailors could have pulled me out in an instant. It seems useless to add that I learned to swim in deep water very rapidly. Father, evidently satisfied that lesson number 1 in practical nautical knowledge was a success, remarked to Stitches, "See how quick she shut her mouth when she hollered about nothing? Nah, if every woman could learn to keep her mouth shut at the age of 2, they'd be better off." Every day after that, during the weeks we were in Newcastle, I was thrown overboard. I came to love it, and soon was a strong swimmer with an instinct for action instead of noise.